At the end of the 3rd century AD, Roman Emperor Diocletian devised a new government system in order to face the constant political instability. The Tetrarchy, an alliance of 4 coexisting emperors who would each rule a portion of the empire. Despite the fact that the Tetrarchy ended the crisis of the 3rd century, new rivalries appeared, and before long, the Tetrarchs would go to war against each other. In Britannia, Flavius Valerius Constantinus was proclaimed as Emperor Constantine by his army, and in Rome, Marcus Aurelius Valerius Maxentius declared himself emperor as well. However, while Constantine's rise to power was accepted by the rest of the emperors, Maxentius was seen as a usurper, and the other tetrarchs allied each other against him. In 312 AD, Constantine drove an army into Maxentius's domain. With a force of 40,000 legionaries, he overran northern Italy, winning 2 major battles. The first near Turin, the second at Verona, where the Praetorian prefect Ruricius Pompeianus, Maxentius's most senior general, was killed. Despite the fact that the advance of Constantine was hard fought, this streak of victories granted him an aura of invincibility. The confident Constantinian host then plunged into the Italian peninsula towards Maxentius's seat of power at Rome. On the 27th of October, Constantine's mounted vanguard was ambushed at Saxa Rubra, a village 9 miles north of Rome. However, this time it was Roman cavalry that fell on the invading force. Soon it became clear that Maxentius himself led the attack. In the early morning, Maxentius marched out of Rome with his entire army. His forces traversed the Via Flaminia, crossing the river Tiber through the Milvian Bridge. The site of the battle chosen by Maxentius was a plain on the northern bank of the Tiber, with the meandering river covering his right flank, and a forested hill covering his left flank. Constantine had a reputation of employing enveloping tactics, so the self-appointed emperor aimed to deprive his enemy of room to maneuver, exploiting the natural disposition of the terrain. Maxentius situated his most veteran troops on the vanguard. The infamous Praetorian Guard was most likely stationed in the first line. They were joined by Maxentius's most experienced legionnaires, who had supported him in earlier conflicts. However, a significant part of his army had been recently levied in sight of Constantine's campaign, and it's likely that the soldiers placed at the rear were noticeably undertrained and inexperienced. The Emperor of Rome had also brought ample cavalry contingents to the fight, many of them Moorish skirmishers. Maxentius himself stood at one of the flanks, surrounded by the Imperial Horse Guard, his most elite cavalry. In total, the esteemed numbers of the Maxentian force are around 70,000 men, twice as many as their contender. However, the terrain prevented them from extending their line, and therefore, Maxentius's formation was probably similar in width to the enemy, but significantly greater in depth. At the other side of the field, the Constantinian host entered the plain. Heeding the commands given to him in his dreams, Constantine had ordered the Chrismon sign to be worn on the shields of his legionaries, and standards and banners displayed this symbol as well. To Maxentius's troops, the sight of Roman legions marching under the Chrismon was probably a strange scenery. Constantine rallied units from Iberia, Britannia, Gaul, and Germania under his command. Unlike the fresh recruits who thickened the enemy lines, the entirety of the attacking army was made up of seasoned troops, who were now at the climax of a 6-month-long military campaign. The heaviest of the Constantinian troops were a fearsome force of Clibanarii, thoroughly armored cavalry, which would later develop into the famous Byzantine cataphract. The emperor himself spearheaded the Clibanarii. As the advance was sounded off, both armies began marching towards each other. The Battle of the Milvian Bridge, who would decide which contender would remain Emperor of Rome, had just begun. The day was opened by the skirmish troops from both sides, who hurled projectiles at the enemy. Not long after, and before the infantry closed in, Constantine performed his opening move. Spearheading his heavy cavalry himself, he darted forward, towards Maxentius's mounted troops. While the Clibanarii swept through enemy skirmishers, the Roman cavalry that was being attacked countercharged Constantine's riders. The impact was dreadful. Men and horses were slain and trampled to death, as the Clibanarii gained the upper hand. While Constantine's cavalry pressed the enemy riders, the infantry contingents finally clashed. Fearsome fighting unleashed along the front lines, and both sides pushed with zeal. The infantry exchanged projectiles towards one another. Javelins, spears, and weighted darts were plunged into each other's ranks before the clash of swords was to follow. Given Constantine's high regard for his cavalry, his riders were likely better armed than their enemy counterparts. Maxentius, realizing this, sprung into action and looked to quickly overwhelm Constantine and gain a quick victory on the flank. However, as his cavalry were gaining the upper hand, Constantine's reserve cavalry quickly sprung into action, attacking the Maxentian cavalry on both flanks. Maxentius' left flank was now engaged with a superior and larger force of enemy cavalry. He quickly ordered forth his reserve infantry to try and turn the tide. Unlike the cavalry engagement, the infantry brawl stalled, with none of the sides gaining an obvious advantage. With the scarce cavalry that remained with him, Maxentius observed the carnage. Despite the inexperience of the rearguard troops, the Maxentian soldiers in the first line proved themselves worthy in battle. The Praetorian Guard administered death to any who dared press on them, and the veterans that joined them stoically held their ground. However, the situation for Maxentius's cavalry contingents was dire. They were being outclassed on both flanks by their eastern comrades and were forced to cede ground. As the onslaught carried on, Constantine's cavalry decisively chased the enemy riders out of the field. The emperor rallied his riders, this time with the intent of tackling Maxentius's personal guard, but his enemy anticipated. Before Constantine could entirely reinstate order among his ranks, the imperial horse guard, led by Maxentius himself, fell upon the Clibanarii. Since Constantine's cavalry outnumbered Maxentius's horse guard, the former was taken by surprise by the latter's daring charge. The impact was devastating for both the aggressors and the aggressed. Now, all forces on the field on both sides were committed, and the emperors and their retinues were engaged with each other in deadly fighting. Eventually, the shock factor wore off for Constantine's cavalry, and their superiority in quality and numbers manifested itself. Some of Maxentius's riders began fleeing, triggering a rout, in which the emperor himself participated. With the right flank completely exposed, and their leader put to flight, the most inexperienced Maxentian soldiers routed as well, abandoning the more experienced soldiers at the front lines to a terrible end. Some of Constantine's cavalry chased off the fleeing soldiers, while another contingent hammered the remaining enemy infantry from behind. This was the end for Maxentius and his men. Maxentius's seasoned Roman legions and Praetorian Guard continued to fight on, refusing to give Constantine's men any quarter. They soon found themselves enveloped by the heavy Eastern Roman cavalry. With their emperor having fled the battlefield and now completely surrounded, the remaining Maxentian soldiers were either cut down in the fighting or continued to fight more furiously as their very lives were at stake. By this point, Constantine had sent word to his commanders to offer clemency to any of the remaining Maxentian soldiers who surrendered, and in return they would be spared their lives, in which they accepted, and the fighting came to a halt. Constantine chased Maxentius's fleeing soldiers back to the Milvian Bridge, which many of them tried to cross to save their lives. Indeed, those who were unable to escape the northern bank were utterly massacred by Constantine's cavalry. Of those who did manage to reach the waters, many were carried away by the stream. When the Milvian Bridge collapsed, overburdened by the tide of fleeing infantry, Maxentius himself fell into the Tiber and eventually died from drowning. The contest for the Roman throne had been settled. After the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, Constantine entered Rome as the uncontested emperor of the Western Roman Empire. The victory at the Milvian Bridge solidified his power and was a turning point for both his personal beliefs and the religious policies that Rome would undergo. Converted into a Christian since the divine intervention that he had seemingly experienced, he issued the Edict of Milan, granting religious tolerance to Christians, and his rule paved the way for the eventual Christianization of the Roman Empire. The Chrismon became one of Constantine's most enduring symbols, forever linking his reign with the rise of Christianity. The Battle of the Milvian Bridge remains one of the most significant events in Western history, marking the beginning of a new era for Rome and the Christian world.